Welcome to Crimeatorium. I'm your host, Madeline. The case I'm about to present to you is not just a case. This is the tale of two promising young people that were savagely tortured and their lives unjustly taken. I first learned of this crime several years ago, and I wanted to present it in a podcast, but have hesitated to release it due to the current climate that we find ourselves in. The crime was not considered a hate crime by law enforcement, nor was it treated as such. I believe it was a crime of opportunity, and that's how I will be presenting it. I hope that the way I do present this case comes across with respect, sensitivity, and reverence for Channon and Chris, as well as their family and friends. This crime is especially brutal. It contains graphic details of a sexual and violent nature. Listener discretion is advised. Knoxville is the third largest city in Tennessee, with a population of 188,000. It is divided into 4 sections: North, South, East, and West Knoxville. The arts and music culture is strong in the area, with bluegrass music being a favorite at the many festivals held there each year. The University of Tennessee is located in Knoxville and was ranked the best Southeastern college by the Princeton Review in 2019 and is considered one of the more selective colleges in terms of admissions. It was in Knoxville that Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom met through mutual friends, and they began dating each other in November of 2006. Channon was 21 and a senior at the University of Tennessee, majoring in sociology. She had less than a year to go before graduating. She was born in Nacogdoches, Texas, on April 29, 1985, to Gary and Dina Christian. The family lived in Texas along with Shannon's older brother Chase until relocating to Knoxville in 1997. Dina, Shannon's mom, was told she would never have children, and so she felt blessed to have 2. Dina said of Channon, quote, "Channon Christian lit up rooms with her toothy smile, fun-loving spirit, and gentle heart. She just loved life. Her friends would always call her with boyfriend issues. She loved children," unquote. Channon wanted to get married someday and have 4 kids, the oldest being a boy, just like her big brother Chase. Christopher Newsom was born on September 21st, 1983 in Knoxville, Tennessee, to parents Hugh and Mary Newsom. Most of Hugh and Mary's children were grown, with the youngest being 13 when Chris was born. The family happily welcomed their energetic baby boy into the family. Chris graduated from Halls High School in 2002, where he excelled at all sports, especially baseball. He started playing when he was very young and continued until he received an injury and had to quit. Chris was also artistic. He enjoyed creating beautiful craft artwork and artistic wood creations. He once thought of becoming a mechanic, but his talent at woodworking guided him into becoming a carpenter. Chris had already brought Channon to meet his parents and confided to his mom that he loved her. On the evening of January 6, 2007, Channon and Chris met up at the Washington Ridge apartment complex in Knoxville, where Shannon's friend, Kara Soward, lived. The plan was for them to go to dinner and then to a friend's party. Chris was late to arrive, and Channon was sitting in the driver's seat of her Toyota 4Runner, waiting for him. Chris stood at the open door of the vehicle, and the two were exchanging kisses with one another. there's no doubt that Chris was trying to smooth things over with Channon about being late. These blissful, priceless moments were interrupted without warning, and what would follow, there's only one word: unimaginable. Lamarcus Davidson was born on June 23, 1981, to a sex worker and crack-addicted mother and an absentee alcoholic father. He was the second to the oldest child of 6 kids. His mother gave birth to the oldest child when she was 15, Lamarcus when she was 16, and the next sibling, Latalvis, was born when his mother was 17. It is said that it was a chaotic household with claims of sexual abuse and severe beatings. The mother eventually left the home, and when Lamarcus was a teen, he was taken into a foster home. From all accounts, he did well in that home and was provided with all of his basic needs and then some. His foster parents have remained loving and supportive of him to this day. Lamarcus was down and out in January of 2007 and in need of some money. His girlfriend, Daphne Sutton, had just left him. He had no car, which made it difficult for him to earn money in the way he chose, which was selling dope. He had just gotten out of prison in August of the previous year for carjacking and aggravated robbery, and was out on parole after serving 5 years. Carjacking and committing robberies was his normal modus operandi. Earlier in the month of January of 2007, Lamarcus Davidson's half-brother, Latalvis Cobbins, traveled from Kentucky to Knoxville to stay with Lamarcus at the house he rented on Chipman Street to spend New Year's with him, as they hadn't seen one another since before Davidson went to prison. Latalvis brought with him his girlfriend Vanessa Coleman and a friend, George Thomas, and George's girlfriend. She ended up going back to Kentucky right away, however. Lamarcus was getting increasingly agitated by the fact that nobody that was staying at the house had any money or a car. Falling back on what he knew how to do best, Lamarcus announced to Latalvis that they and a friend, Eric Boyd, would be carjacking someone during the stay in Knoxville. Latalvis claims that he was opposed to this idea. On the night of January 6th, Eric Boyd arrived in a white Pontiac Sunbird vehicle that he had borrowed from his cousin, Adrienne Mathis. Lamarcus summoned Latalvis into the kitchen and told him that he wanted to introduce him to a girl. One big tragedy among many in this is that the place that this girl supposedly lived was located at the Washington Ridge apartment complex, the exact place where Channon and Chris were at the time. The 3 men got into the white Sunbird with Eric in the driver's seat, Lamarcus in the passenger seat, and Latalvis in the back. The apartment complex was not too far from the house on Chipman Street. As they pulled into the parking lot trying to find the apartment this girl lived in, Lamarcus and Eric spotted Shannon's white Toyota 4Runner and subsequently saw Chris and Channon. Channon and Chris's fate was sealed at that point. Lamarcus and Eric got out of the car and held a gun to Chris's head and told him to get into Shannon's SUV. They then tied Shannon's hands together and put her in the back seat. They also tied Chris's hands together. Latalvis stayed in the Sunbird and followed Lamarcus and Eric as they drove off in Shannon's SUV. Davidson and Boyd arrived at the house on Chipman Street, as well as Latalvis, where he entered the home first. Lamarcus and Eric walked both Channon and Chris through the front door. Shannon's hands were still tied, as was Chris's, and both had a bandana over their eyes and hoodies over their heads. Davidson claimed that Channon grabbed his arm and said, quote, "I don't want to die," unquote. Davidson also told authorities that he promised Channon, on the life of his daughter, that he would get her out of this. The terror Channon and Chris must have felt would have been indescribable. LaTalvis claims on the witness stand that he didn't want anything to do with whatever his brother Lamarcus was up to, and when he and the others tried to leave, Lamarcus pulled out his gun, and even though he didn't point it at anyone, it caused them to feel threatened. Channon was led into Davidson's bedroom and placed on the air mattress. Chris remained in the living room with LaTalvis, Vanessa, and Eric. George and Lamarcus took Shannon's credit card and left in her SUV. At some point, while George and Lamarcus had Shannon's vehicle, they robbed a Pizza Hut. This account is what LaTalvis testified to on the stand, so the truthfulness of it all is in question, but it's the only account of the events that are available. LaTalvis states that he went and looked in on Channon, and he said that her hands were still tied together above her head and secured to a duffel bag full of weights. Her feet were also tied together and secured the same way. The bandana was no longer covering her mouth. She asked LaTalvis for water. He retrieved the water and untied her hands where it was attached to the duffel bag so she could sit up and drink the water. She asked where her boyfriend Chris was, and to please see if he could convince Davidson to let her go. She said she was willing to do anything. LaTalvis claims that she offered him oral sex. He then stated, quote, "I had her give me oral sex," unquote. He hung his head as he recounted the last part, as if he was ashamed of what had transpired. It comes across as disingenuous as does his whole recounting of the events. He ejaculated and it got on Shannon's shirt and her pants due to her spitting it out. There is information in some of the documentation that he hurt her lip during the assault. He heard a sound and got nervous, so he fixed his clothes and secured Shannon's hands back to the duffel bag. Lamarcus and George returned to Chipman Street from robbing the Pizza Hut in Shannon's SUV. LaTalvis and George claimed to authorities that Eric Boyd walked out of the house with Chris at gunpoint, and when he came back, Chris wasn't with him. They also stated that they noticed dark stains on his shirt. They also both implicated Eric Boyd in the raping of Channon. These claims will be a topic for a major dispute later on in this case. That was the end of Saturday night. On Sunday, January 7th, Channon was repeatedly subjected to torture, rape in various ways, and severe beatings. It is believed that a broken chair leg had been used on her. Later on in the night, Lamarcus led Channon out of the bedroom and brought her into the kitchen. She was naked from the waist down. No pants, shoes, or socks. LaTalvis, in an unconvincing show of emotion, stated that Lamarcus put his arm around Shannon's neck and tried to choke her. Channon fell to the floor, and it was thought that she was dead. As it turns out, she wasn't. Along with LaTalvis, Vanessa Coleman was also in the kitchen and witnessed this attempted murder of Channon by strangulation, and was even asked by Davidson to check Shannon's pulse. Noting that the strangulation didn't work, Lamarcus took a hold of Channon and hogtied her in a fetal position, wrapped a white grocery bag around her head, placed her in 5 trash bags, and put her in a garbage can. She was tied so tightly that her knees were touching her cheeks. But at some point during Shannon's ordeal, bleach had been poured on her body and down her throat. This was while she was alive. The perpetrators claimed this was to dispose of any DNA. On Sunday, January 7th, Shannon's parents had received a phone call from her work stating that Channon hadn't shown up for her shift. Dina knew this wasn't like Channon. Dina was already on alert because Channon had called her on a Saturday night. It later came out that Channon had done this at the urging of Lamarcus. She told her mom that she would be home that night, and of course, she didn't come home. Dina called the Newsoms to inform them that Channon hadn't gone to work that day and of their concern for her whereabouts. Because Chris was 23, he would be gone for a night or two, and it wouldn't alarm the Newsoms, so they weren't expecting him to be home. The Newsoms and the Christians both knew that their kids wouldn't have run away, so the police were called. Being that Channon and Chris were both adults, the police wouldn't go out just yet looking for them. The two families plus friends started investigating Channon and Chris's location themselves. After they scoured the streets, Shannon's SUV was spotted near the Chipman Street home. Upon inspection, they noted that there was mud on the floorboard and the seat was pushed back. After this discovery was made, the police became involved and the SUV was towed away and later processed by technicians for fingerprints and other possible crime scene evidence. On January 7th, locomotive engineer Jay Ford was operating a train between Cherry Street and 9th Avenue. He spotted something that he thought was a piece of burnt wood. Upon further inspection, he could tell it was a body. He described what he saw as a severely burned man with no clothes on. He contacted the railroad dispatcher, who in turn called the police. They arrived shortly thereafter. It was the burnt remains of Christopher Newsom. Chris and Channon endured an assault of such brutality that there are no words in any language to adequately describe what these two went through. Throughout this ordeal, Chris had been repeatedly raped anally with an object. That object was thought to be the same broken leg that was used on Channon. He had been gagged with a sock that had been stuffed into his mouth. His ankles were tied with his own belt, and his hands were tied around his back. A sweatshirt was tied around his neck and secured with shoestrings. It was in this condition that he was forced to walk barefoot out near the railroad tracks, made to kneel, and was shot in the neck, the back, and point-blank range to the head. Gas was then doused onto his body, and he was lit on fire. He was not alive when the fire was lit. It has been conjectured that he had been sexually assaulted by the railroad tracks a final time before being shot and set afire. A police sergeant and a captain arrived at the Newsom's door to perform the daunting task of informing them that their son's body had been found. Hugh and Mary asked the officers how they knew it was Chris, and the sergeant answered, "I could tell by his eyes." The sergeant's son and Chris had been friends. Mary Newsom collapsed. Meanwhile, investigators had gathered evidence from inside of Shannon's SUV. Fingerprints that were found on a bank statement in the SUV were later identified as belonging to Lamarcus Davidson. Davidson's address was obtained, and on January 8th, Lieutenant Keith LeBeau and 3 SWAT team members entered the home on Chipman Street. After surveying the area, they were able to ascertain that the house was vacant. Lieutenant DeBeau entered the kitchen. He quickly spotted a garbage can in the corner that was oddly shaped. He walked over to it and removed the lid. Channon Christian's body had been found. An acquaintance of Gary Christian's called him and told him that something was going on at a house near where Chris's body had been found. An ambulance was there, and this acquaintance thought that Channon's body had been discovered. This is the only account I could find on how the Christians were notified of Channon's death. On January 11th, Eric Boyd ended up being stopped by police, and he voluntarily took police officers to a vacant house where he had assisted LaMarcus in hiding out. When they approached the house, LaMarcus surrendered. It is said by some that he was wearing Chris Newsom's tennis shoes. Davidson was transported to the Knoxville Police Department. Investigators were able to acquire the names of the parties involved. Warrants were served, and all were arrested. LaTalvis, George, and Vanessa were transported from Kentucky to Knoxville to face their charges. LaTalvis was set to go to trial first, where Judge Richard Baumgartner was to oversee the proceedings. His charges were first-degree murder for Channon and the facilitating for first-degree murder for Chris. He faced the death penalty for these charges. He chose to testify on his own behalf. After 8 to 9 hours, the jury came back with a guilty verdict on all counts. The sentencing was scheduled to take place the next day. Dina, Gary, Chase, Hugh, and Mary, as well as Chris's sister Debbie Wadley, were able to give their impact statements prior to the sentencing. During Hugh's impact statement, he addressed LaTalvis directly and appealed to him to testify against Eric Boyd, who they always believed was the one that killed Chris. LaTalvis appeared unfazed by Hugh's plea. Once these statements were complete, the defendant rose, and the judge handed down the sentence of life in prison plus 100 years without the possibility of parole. Since there are 5 defendants, I won't go through each and every trial. I will go into more detail for LaMarcus Davidson and Eric Boyd. Vanessa Coleman was charged with facilitation of first-degree murder for Channon and first-degree murder for Chris. She was found guilty only of the facilitation of the murder of Channon. She was sentenced to 53 years. George Thomas was convicted and given 2 consecutive life sentences without parole for the charge of first-degree murder of Chris and Channon. Eric Boyd was considered an accessory after the fact and was convicted of harboring a fugitive. He was sentenced to 18 years. He appealed this conviction, claiming that Daphne Sutton, Davidson's ex-girlfriend, played a bigger role in hiding him than Boyd did, and she wasn't charged because of her being white and her ties to the Knoxville Police Department. The motion was denied. Channon and Chris's families both felt that he played a bigger role in the murders than what he was charged for by law enforcement. In Davidson's trial, he was offered to have the death penalty taken off the table in exchange for a guilty plea for first-degree murder. He turned it down, claiming he would rather die than spend life in prison. The defense attorneys for Davidson took an angle of making the victims look bad by pointing out alleged marijuana use by Chris and Channon. It was a rather heated trial. Words were exchanged between the families and the defense attorneys, prompting the judge to implore the court to, in essence, behave. Video was shown to the jury of the crime scene. Experts testified to finding Davidson's palm print on the trash bag that Channon was placed in, as well as on a bank statement that was in Shannon's SUV. Dina and Mary were called to the stand to identify items that belonged to Channon and Chris. They both took this opportunity to tell the jury things about the two that would offset the negative implications from the defense. Assistant District Attorney Takesha Fitzgerald decided to address the drug issue head-on and asked Dina and Mary if they were aware that Channon and Chris smoked marijuana. Mary answered no, and Dina stated that she knew about it and felt it was somewhat normal for kids at that age to experiment. Davidson chose not to testify on his own behalf. After 9 days of trial, the prosecution and the defense gave their closing statements. The jury deliberated 8 hours before finding Lamarcus Davidson guilty of first-degree felony murder of Channon and Chris. They also found him guilty of kidnapping, robbery, and rape of Channon, and the facilitation of the rape of Chris. The jury decided on a sentence of death by lethal injection. When it was announced by Judge Baumgartner, there was an audible gasp from the victims' families, despite warnings from him not to do so. It has been said that Davidson was sorry that he hadn't taken the plea deal. In 2011, Judge Baumgartner, the presiding judge in all of the trials, was under criminal investigation by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation for buying drugs from a defendant who appeared in his court, Dina Castleman. He was also using his influence to gain her leniency in various court cases in exchange for sex. The judge stepped down from his position, and he subsequently pled guilty to official misconduct. His 2-year sentence was suspended, and he was granted judicial diversion, which means his record was expungible. Judge Baumgartner died on January 23, 2018, of natural causes. As a result of these events, the defendants in the Newsom Christian case all filed motions for new trials, and all of them were granted except for Davidson. The courts had no choice but to grant these motions. Later on, though, Cobbin's motion for a new trial was overturned. That meant that Chris and Shannon's family had to endure another 3 trials. Although later on, you will hear that there will be yet another one. The trials went forward, and all of the defense were found guilty once again and received the same sentences, except for Vanessa Coleman. Hers was reduced to 35 years. She was recently up for parole in 2014, but was denied. Lamarcus Davidson has motioned for a new trial several times throughout the years. All have been denied. Davidson is housed at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, Unit 2 in Nashville, where he sits on death row. Eric Boyd, who was 47 by this time, was finally arraigned on charges of felony murder, first-degree murder, aggravated robbery, aggravated kidnapping, and aggravated rape in a 36-count indictment after new evidence linked him to the rape of Channon and the murder and rape of Chris. George Thomas cut a deal with the prosecution to have his sentence reduced to 50 years in exchange for his testimony against Boyd. His testimony was key in this case, as it claimed that Boyd was the one that set Chris on fire and killed him while the others remained in the house. The trial lasted a week, and Boyd was convicted on all 36 of the charges against him. He was given 2 life sentences without parole. Asked if he had anything to say, he just said, quote, "I'm innocent," unquote. His demeanor throughout these proceedings has been described as smug. Less than 3 months after his trial, Boyd filed a motion for a retrial, citing insufficient evidence. That motion was denied. Hugh Newsom said of the aftermath, quote, "Our final goodbye to Chris. We embraced him in his body bag. We were not allowed to see him. At that particular time, Mary and I both promised we would not stop until Eric Boyd was prosecuted for killing him," unquote. Epilogue. Channon Gail Christian was laid to rest in Highland Memorial West Cemetery on January 14th. Hugh Christopher Newsom was laid to rest on January 13th in Woodhaven Memorial Gardens. The house on Chipman Street was demolished, and the land was purchased by Waste Connections Incorporated, and a permanent memorial for Chris and Channon was erected on that site. In 2008, a golf tournament and memorial foundation were established in Shannon's memory to provide a scholarship for a Farragut High School senior to attend the University of Tennessee. A Little League baseball tournament in Chris's honor was held at the Halls Community Park in 2008 and 2009. There is also a memorial plaque that bears his name displayed there. A memorial scholarship is given annually in his name to a graduating Halls High School baseball player. Hugh turned 81 last August, and both he and Mary look healthy and happy. Dina and Gary are divorced, and Gary has since remarried. He gives inspirational speeches at churches from all over and has let the anger he had go. He also formed a motorcycle club called Shepherd's RC. The members ride in memory of Channon and strongly promote the carrying of weapons and learning self-defense skills. A paragraph from their website reads, "We ride through the valley of the shadow of death, but we will not fear evil, because Christ is in us. We will not fear the storm, because the man that calmed the sea rides with us. We can do nothing without Christ, and it is for His glory that we exist. Evil took Channon away from us too soon, and the second she took her last breath, God took her back from evil. She now is with Christ in paradise." Mary Newsom remembers the last Christmas she spent with her son, and when she asked him what he wanted for Christmas, his answer was world peace, she said, and I thought, my God, he's got peace now. Not in this world, but he's got peace. I hope he would be proud of us. Thank you for listening to the heartbreaking tale of Chris and Channon. Look for another episode to be released on August 22nd. If you haven't done so, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you feel so inclined, go to Apple Podcasts and leave an honest review. It's always good to read those, and they are very much appreciated. If you would like to connect, Crimeatorium can be found on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. For pictures from this episode and other episodes, go to crimeatorium.com or the Crimeatorium Facebook page. There is also a case suggestion form on the website. I would be very interested in getting requests and suggestions from you listeners. I also left a link below to donate to the Charlie Project. The work Megan does on that site is invaluable to those affected by missing loved ones. All episodes are researched, written, narrated, and edited by me, Madeline.